All right, kids. Well, congratulations. You've made it to your final launch video of the first semester, week 17. And all we're going to do today is really wrap up the tail end of Reconstruction, talk about why and how it ends and why and how it fails to achieve the long lasting political, economic, and social change that the radical Republicans in Congress would have preferred, as well as ensure that you are prepared for your final test, which is, of course, this week during your live session. So today we're going to talk about Grant's Reconstruction, right? We talked a little bit at the beginning about Lincoln's Reconstruction, which was really wartime Reconstruction, how to reconstruct the states that are conquered as the war carries out. We talked about Johnson's Reconstruction with his vetoes of the renewal of the Freedmen's Bureau, his veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is what causes radical Republicans to pass the 14th Amendment. We talked about the Black Codes, sharecropping, right? We spent our live session this past week talking about radical Reconstruction or military Reconstruction, in which the Republicans in Congress, with their veto-proof majority, are going to enact legislation and enforce Reconstruction via the military in the South, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and some of the progress made there with the election of Black senators and legislatures and local legislators as well as a Black governor. Right. And the very tail end of class, we talked about really some of the shortcomings of Reconstruction that are driven by white Southern resistance with paramilitary groups like the KKK and the White League. And we ended class with that really powerful cartoon, right? The Worse Than Slavery Perspective from Thomas Nast. So we ended class as well with the election of Grant with that strategy that I told you was referred to as waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt. Right, here's the cartoon reminder of it for you, of reminding voters that it was Democrats who seceded, it was Democrats who caused the Civil War, it was Democrats who caused the turmoil and bloodshed and destruction of the war. Therefore, you should vote Republican. And it's a very successful strategy as it gets Grant elected in 1868 as a Republican war hero. A couple really noteworthy successes to point out, both of which were in last week's live session as well, but it's still important that we attribute them to Grant's administration, not just Reconstruction as a whole. But under Grant's administration, in his first term, we see the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which of course grants Black male suffrage, the voting rights, via the 15th Amendment, saying that you cannot lose the right to vote based on your race, your color, or your previous condition of servitude. And then we also see under Grant's administration the passage and enforcement of the Enforcement Acts, which uses the power of the federal government to use to push for federal prosecution of the KKK, as well as other similar Klan-motivated voter intimidation and violence that's taking place in the South. So those are the two big successes under Grant's administration. As Grant is a strong believer in the Reconstruction agenda. The problem for Grant comes more so later in his presidency via corruption. And not necessarily Grant-driven corruption, but corruption from people who are associated with Grant and his presidency. So 4 years into Grant's term, we see in 1872, Grant runs for re-election, and he wins in what we can most definitely consider a landslide, as he wins 81% of the Electoral College vote. He wins a significant majority of the popular vote. In a resounding electoral win. So Grant's policies, as of 1872, when Reconstruction is still working, are popular, right? The Republican vote in the South, largely driven by Black voters, as well as the scalawags and carpetbaggers that we referred to last week. They come out for him in the West. We see in the North almost total Republican control of every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, as well as out here in the West. The Republicans are very popular there as well. So we see Grant as a very popular president here by 1872, but yet somehow by the end of his presidency and in history, he's looked at as a very ineffective and poor president. And that's largely driven by scandal. Now, as we know, Grant is a Civil War hero, right? Battle of Vicksburg. He is the general who oversees the surrender of the Confederate troops in Virginia. So he's something of a military celebrity in the country after the Civil War, but he has no political experience. He has no political experience at all. There's one valid criticism of him is that he's too trusting of those who were surrounding him, too trusting of his cabinet and his advisors, largely because he lacks political experience, so thus he has to rely on them more, and that gets him into some trouble. He's linked with both the moderate part of the Republican Party, who's going to start leaving the ideas of Reconstruction behind to focus more on pro-business policies and priorities, much like the Whigs, who the Republicans are, of course, the descendant of. He also has some connections with the radicals, the radical Republicans who are more concerned about social and political change for freedmen. However, his cabinet is riddled with scandal, largely from people close to him trying to take advantage of the rapid economic growth that the country is going to go through after the Civil War. And because of the well-publicized scandals, the well-published and publicized and discussed scandals in his presidency, people will begin associating his presidency with corruption. And because of that association, they're going to increasingly turn away from the Republican Party in a way that shouldn't surprise us because of this association of Grant with corruption. It becomes known as Grantism, which is never good for your presidency to be associated in name with something negative like that. And again, these aren't scandals that Grant himself is involved in, but people very close to him are. The two you should know that are pretty noteworthy. The first is the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which, as the nation is building its first transcontinental railroad, of course, passed via the Republican administration during the Civil War with the Pacific Railway Act, the company that's getting government money to build the railroad is like creating other pretend companies and hiring executives who are close to Grant and paying them huge salaries to do nothing, right? And using taxpayer money to pay for the railroad to pay their salaries instead. So that becomes a huge big scandal in railroad construction. The other is the whiskey ring, as tax collectors associated with the Republican Party are going to be stealing the liquor tax revenue using a series of bribes of officials and the like. So both of these scandals, they get pretty big. There's other scandals as well. These are the two big ones that really start to damage the credibility of the Republican Party because of these scandals. This cartoon does a good job of pointing out the problem. Here's Grant saying, I beg to repeat that these frauds in the government shall be probed to the very bottom, right? And he's going like all these scandals he keeps pulling out and deeper and deeper and deeper into the barrel. And obviously it shows that he's in over his head, if you will. Additionally, under Grant's administration, we see two more really noteworthy events that have an impact on Reconstruction. The first is the amnesty. Amnesty kind of means like forgiveness, formal like political forgiveness. The Amnesty Act of 1872, which is going to allow many former Confederate officials to vote and hold office. Maybe the philosophy being like, well, it's been 7 years since the war ended. They've had it hard enough. We can let them back into the political system now, which is going to cause a series of former Confederate officials to get elected to political office in the South, unfortunately. And the second is the Panic of 1873, which is going to cause incredible economic distress in the country. And because of this economic distress, people are going to increasingly lose their appetite, right, for paying a lot of money as a country to keep the military in the South, for example, to pay for the Freedmen's Bureau, for example, right? When everybody's broke, it's very difficult to justify spending federal government money on programs that aren't exactly as popular as they once were. So in 1873, the US economy is going to go into a severe recession. It's going to last about 6 or 7 years, a long time recession. At its peak, we see 2 million unemployed individuals in the country. It's caused by Civil War currency. As you remember from the war, the US government and the Confederate States of America are going to print a ton of paper money during the war to try to pay for war expenses, but that causes insane inflation after the war as there's too much money in circulation. And the question becomes like, how do you get rid of paper money in circulation? Because people expect having money to use that money as a good of exchange, as a bill of exchange, excuse me. So like how do you just get rid of paper money when you've already started printing it? So that causes inflation. And the second cause is overextension of industry. We see a significant amount of economic growth because of the Civil War. I told you in our video last week that the Civil War is a catalyst for increased economic growth that was already occurring via the market revolution. The problem is industry is going to grow too fast. Industry is going to grow too fast. And anytime something grows too fast, it usually collapses back towards the earth. And in this case, this is no different than every other panic, right? Panic of 1819, 1837, and 1873. All three of those big panics are caused by the overexpansion of something, In 19 and 37, it was largely westward expansion. Too many people buying land in the West caused a land boom, and that's what collapsed. Here it's industry as well as Civil War currency. But because the Republican Party is the party in charge, whether it's their fault or not, in this case, it probably is just a series of economic events that made this panic inevitable. But because the Republican Party is in charge, people are going to increasingly turn to the Democrats to solve their problems, to fix their problems, because that's just the way things work in economic panics. You might remember during Martin Van Buren's presidency in 1837, with the Panic of 1837, right? It wasn't Van Buren's fault. He had just inherited this mess from Jackson with the bank veto and specie circular. And then here we are. Jackson's like, I just showed up. Van Buren's like, I just showed up. It's not my fault, right? But it didn't matter. 3.5 years later, the Whigs get their first president elected, William Henry Harrison, even though he dies in a month from pneumonia, largely because public opinion had shifted against the Democrats due to the panic. In this case, no different, right? 1873, people are going to blame Republicans for the panic and thus increasingly choose Democrats to fix the problem. So concurrently, right here in the 1870s, we're going to see a series of events kind of all coalescing into the end of Reconstruction. Right? The Panic of 1873 is part of it, most definitely. The Amnesty Act is part of it, most definitely. The College Board specifically outlines, and I think it's important for you to know as well, that the Supreme Court plays a huge role in limiting the effectiveness and the power of Reconstruction as well, with a series of court cases that are going to gradually chip away at how much enforcement ability the federal government has to force the South to obey these demands on citizenship and voting rights, et cetera. So the Civil Rights Act is passed by the Republican Congress in 1875. And sadly enough, it's the last time we see significant civil rights legislation passed for about 85 or 90 years. So we're going to go through a long, dark period upcoming in this course in which no civil rights progress is made. And the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is really the last attempt to really cement some of these gains from Reconstruction into law. And the Civil Rights Act is supposed to ensure equal access to public places like parks, schools, movie theaters, when they're not movies yet, but theaters for performances and for music and for plays. But unfortunately, there's no enforcement mechanism. The states aren't forced to comply. And despite that, it still becomes the last act passed by the Republican Congress to Reconstruction. But the next 4 court cases are all going to work really specifically to limit Reconstruction. The first is called the Slaughterhouse cases. They're brought to the Supreme Court in 1873. And this really is the case that creates the precedent for the other cases, which is why it's important. Now, in this case, the court still largely run by more conservative voices. This is really the big reason why the court's going to make these decisions. But these conservative voices on the Supreme Court are going to take a very, very, very strict interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Now, you might remember strict and loose interpretation. Here it is again. We really started the semester with it, and we're ending the semester with it. But they're going to take a very strict interpretation with the 14th Amendment, arguing that only states, not the federal government, only the states themselves have authority over what rights citizens have or don't have. A very strict interpretation that's going to thus ensure that like states are who gets to decide who can do X, Y, and Z, right? And thus it's going to allow the southern states to say, well, if it's our decision to say it, then like, no, we don't need to ensure Black equality, Black progress, et cetera. All right, so that's the first case that creates the precedent for these others. That same year, Bradwell versus Illinois is another court case that has less to do with Reconstruction, but more to do with this overall era of the court of conservatism. In this case, a female lawyer, a female attorney is going to sue for her right to practice law, to be a lawyer officially. And the Supreme Court is going to rule that, first of all, you're a woman, so therefore you don't have the right to practice law, so we shouldn't even be hearing this case at all. So in that case, I like to compare this court case to like the female version of Dred Scott, in that the case was decided based not on the findings in the case, but the case was decided based on the ideology that a Black man or a woman had no right to sue anyway, therefore we shouldn't be here. So that's going to set women's rights back, making it very clear that the 14th Amendment, in this case, does not apply to women either. The next two, U.S. versus Cruikshank in 76 and U.S. versus Reese in 1876, same year, are both going to have drastic consequences for the future of Reconstruction. In this case, Louisiana white supremacists are accused in the Colfax massacre that I talked about in class live this week of attacking a meeting of African Americans, and they are convicted under the Enforcement Act. We talked about those acts that are passed to limit violence and intimidation against African Americans. They are convicted under the Enforcement Acts. Unfortunately, they sue to argue that the Enforcement Acts themselves are unconstitutional because they're discriminatory, because they are, the federal government doesn't have the right to tell people what to do, basically, is the argument. And the Supreme Court rules in this case that the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Amendment, only applies to if the state of Louisiana, the state of Alabama, they can't discriminate against you. But this court ruling then argues that the 14th Amendment does not apply to individual people or to their businesses. So people and businesses can discriminate against whoever they want. That's their right. The 14th Amendment only applies to what the state itself does. Again, a strict and limiting interpretation of the 14th Amendment. U.S. versus Reese, that same year. In this case, the court rules that it is the states themselves that are allowed to decide who votes, who has the right to vote, not the federal government, right? And in this case, what they're arguing is the 15th Amendment says the state cannot take away your right to vote based on your race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but that's all it says. So the states, after that point, as long as they're not using it just race or color, they can decide however they want who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote. Right, so in that case, we see a significant limiting of the enforcement of the 14th Amendment up here with Cruikshank, and the 15th Amendment down here with U.S. v. Reese. So those court cases are going to all limit the effectiveness and the enforcement of Reconstruction. Right? As you know, Reconstruction is only enforceable by really the military and by force anyway, and now even that's limited. Right, so now we're going to see extra white Southern resistance being more effective because the limitation of Reconstruction is limited there. So meanwhile, we're going to see Northern support waning or decreasing. Right? Northern support's going to wane or decrease. And these things are all going to work in tandem to really end Reconstruction. Why does Northern support wane? First, grantism and corruption leads people to not trust the government as much, especially for a project as big as Reconstruction, which requires a lot of trust. The second reason is the Panic of 1873, which is a 6-year-long depression. As when people are struggling financially, they're far less eager to want to support aggressive social programs, right? Which is driven by these key monetary or money issues. How does the government get rid of that $432 million worth of paper money that was issued in the Civil War? And people that bought war bonds, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, should, when the government buys back those war bonds to give people their money back, should that buyback be paid in specie, hard currency, or greenbacks? This is going to be some of the things that fuel the panic. As well as public opinion shifts away from Reconstruction and instead begins focusing more clearly on westward expansion and the Indian wars on the frontier that we'll talk about in period 6. So as the military is then being not needed, but used to fight Native American tribes on the frontier, Americans are less likely to support the further use of the military in the South as well. Again, Northern opinion also is kind of fed up with trying to reconstruct a region that has no desire to be reconstructed. This white Southern resistance is stubborn, long, and strong, and in doing so, it helps lead to a decrease in Northern support for these causes. All right. And all of that kind of gives us, the context of all that gives us a really good cartoon from Thomas Nast here. This cartoon is published in 1868, but it holds true into the 1870s. It's argument that this is a white man's government. Again, pointing out that line that Nast uses frequently. Keep in mind that Nast here is not condoning the idea of white man's government. He's trying to expose what's happening in the country. And here we have Irish immigrants from New York City, who, as you know, immigrants are largely going to vote Democrat. We see Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, with his Confederate States of America belt buckle here, and Northern big business. And all three of them are teaming up to stand on the back of a Black Civil War soldier, right, draped in the flag, which is a really powerful cartoon depicting some of the forces that are working against Black progress here in the 1860s and 70s. The bottom caption says, "We regard the Reconstruction Acts of Congress as usurpations and unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void." And that's the Democratic platform in 1868. So it becomes very clear quite quickly that the Democratic Party is clearly opposed to using the power of the federal government to push for change. And then, so therefore, as soon as Republican support starts to dwindle, thus you end up in a situation in which Reconstruction's on its last legs. And Reconstruction's on its last legs by 1876 as it is. Just so happens that there also is then a presidential election that year that turns out to be incredibly contentious, close, and very bitter, very bitter. So in 1876, Grant has run his 2 terms. Grant actually considers running for a 3rd term before being talked out of it to honor the legacy of George Washington, which leaves the Democrats running a very popular man named Samuel Tilden. Here he is. And the Republicans having to settle for a boring, simple nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes. This is because the Republican Party is beginning to split into factions, a more pro-business faction and a more like pro-Reconstruction faction. And both factions want their nominee to be, their preference to be the nominee. So Rutherford B. Hayes is kind of seen as like a compromise between the 2 groups. But anytime you're a compromise between 2 groups, like a Henry Clay, right, obviously puts you at a disadvantage because then there's like half of your own party who isn't really sold on you being the nominee. So that's Hayes. That's Hayes. Hayes against Tilden here in 1876. And Tilden, the Democrat, is going to win the popular vote by kind of a lot. Let's go down here. He wins the popular vote by a decent margin in the states that have counted. And he's only 1 electoral college vote away from the victory, from having the majority in the electoral college. And in this case, there's 3 states that are incredibly contested. The Republicans say they won the state. The Democrats say they won the state. And all 3 states are southern states that are dealing with Reconstruction issues, right? We see Louisiana being one of them, Florida being another, and South Carolina being another. Now, if Tilden had won any of those 3, he would have won the presidency. Neither side wants to back down. We see the election taking place in November. In the next 2.5 months, in that lame duck period, both sides are threatening the other with violence. Eventually, the House and the Senate agree to create a electoral commission, a group to decide who to give the votes to because it's so close and so contested. And eventually, the electoral commission is going to give all the votes, all 3 states of the votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. Why would the commission do that? Because there's 15 people on the commission, 8 of them are Republican, 7 are Democrat. And with those 3 states in his camp, with those 3 states in his bag, in his count, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president, and Samuel Tilden loses by 1 vote, by 1 electoral college vote. Now, imagine, right, like being a Southern Democrat and being incredibly upset that you feel like the election was stolen from you. This might sound familiar. Here we are in 2020. Some similarities. So the Southern Democrats and some of the Northern Democrats are furious, feeling like all 3 of those states that were too close to call, basically, this commission just gave all of them to Hayes. That seems inequitable. That seems unfair. And the Southern Democrats specifically are threatening to secede again, to march onto Washington, D.C. and cause blood in the streets over the fact that they think the presidency has been stolen from them. Now, if we're being honest, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida are all engaging in significant voter intimidation against Black voters. If we look at the South in this presidential election, the entire South votes Democrat, which is kind of crazy since just 4 years prior, most of the South had voted Republican. So what happened there? I mean, that's what I told you guys in class in our live session, if you keep Black voters from voting, then you allow the Democrats to win the South. And that's exactly what happens here. So both sides have a pretty valid complaint. Of the people that voted, Tilden probably would have won, but Tilden only won because they kept many, many, many Black voters from voting. So we have this incredibly contentious election. And it's looking somewhat like the US is either going to go through another civil war or just an incredible social turmoil, maybe like a bleeding Kansas type of mini civil war. The compromise that's reached is the Democrats agree to allow and accept Hayes to be president, the Republican to be president. They accept that. Fine, whatever. We'll take Hayes as president. Right? We see these cartoons that show like Tilden or blood. Right? The Democratic threat here it is civil war. Tilden or blood. Tilden or blood. So the Democrat threats are quite sincere, but they agree to allow Hayes to become president if on a couple conditions. Condition one, Hayes pulls the U.S. military troops out of the South. Now, as you know, that's the only thing holding Reconstruction together is the military presence. And if you look at this election map, it's like it shows that the military presence isn't even doing its job anymore anyway. Pull the troops out of the South. Two, invest federal funds into some infrastructure in the South, like railroads. Could have done that earlier. But yes, if Hayes commits to spending federal money to help the South develop better infrastructure. Three, appoint a Southerner to his cabinet, the first Southerner in the presidential cabinet since James Buchanan's presidency before secession. And to no longer commit to so strictly enforcing racial equality. So Hayes accepts those conditions. He becomes president. The Democrats get what they want, which is the end of federal military presence in the South, as well as some infrastructure and political support. And we all move forward except for Black America, who then is left behind by this compromise. So this compromise marks the end of Reconstruction, because Reconstruction is only the time in which the military is there reconstructing the South, socially, politically, economically. But the compromise is not the reason Reconstruction fails. Reconstruction is failing, and then the compromise just ends it. Reconstruction fails for 6 reasons. First is the lack of economic reform. Right? Even through Reconstruction, as we're seeing Black voices politically and socially, most Black Americans in the South are still left in a cycle of poverty via sharecropping and tenant farming. So until economic change is really undertaken to change Black futures, that's one of the reasons Reconstruction fails. The second is violence and white resistance in the South. Right? We talked about this in class last week, the KKK and the White League. As well as white control of local politics, right? The city councils and the mayors and the sheriff office and all these like local things that are on the ground level politics with white control means that true change for Black America would have been incredibly difficult. Right? The military can't be everywhere, and nor can we leave the military there forever, because then that's just occupation by a foreign foe, not by your own country. The third reason it fails is the Supreme Court cases, which weaken the enforcement ability of the government with Reconstruction. The 2 to know, of course, are Cruikshank and Reese. The fourth is Republican corruption. The credit mobilier scandal and the whiskey ring are going to lead to a lack of trust in the Republican Party. The fifth is the Panic of 1873. Country is broke, and because the country is broke, Reconstruction is less and less popular as they wait for the federal government to spend money. And the sixth is the North's waning or decreasing resolve. The North's desire to keep trying to fix the problems in the South eventually are going to run out of steam. So Reconstruction fails, which allows for a new time period in the South called Southern redemption, as the South, quote unquote, redeems themselves. I would not agree that it's the South redeeming themselves is what the South calls it, but the white South calls it their redemption period as they get back to the way things should have been all along after that terribly oppressive federal government told them how to treat the people and who to let vote and whatnot. Now, Southern redemption is going to really, of course, begin with that Amnesty Act that I just discussed with you a couple slides ago, removing voter restrictions from former Confederate officials, except for high-ranking officials and high-ranking officers in the military. But what this does is it allows former Confederate officials to vote and hold office in the South again, which is going to lead to exactly that. Once you let this happen, and once more and more white Democrats are voting and fewer Black Republicans are voting, the Democrats are going to reestablish what they call home rule. It's a very important phrase that's used then in College Board, as used a couple times as well. Home rule, which basically means local control, right? Home rule, we're governing ourselves again. The oppressive northern federal government's no longer telling us what to do in our own states and our own lives. Home rule might be on a cartoon on your chest, who knows? Right, and then also the embrace of what's called the solid South, meaning like if you're a white Southerner, you're voting Democrat. If you remember from last week in class, the White League's platform that said, like, put aside our differences. We should unite on the fact that we have the same racial identity. And that's what's going to happen in the South as white Southerners are going to almost wholeheartedly for the next 20 to 30 years vote Democrat because of this idea of the solid South. We see this over time. Southern Democrats state control. At what point do Democrats take back control of the state governments in the South? Tennessee goes first in 1869, Virginia and North Carolina by 1870. By 1871, Georgia's back in Democrat hands. 73, Texas. The following year, Alabama and Arkansas. 2 years later, we see Mississippi back in Democrat control. And the last three are, of course, those last three that are contested in the election of 1876, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which go back to Democratic control after the Compromise of 1877 and the pullout of troops. In this cartoon, we see a caricature of a black man with guns pointed to both sides of his head. And you can't see the caption, but the caption says, "What do you mean? Of course he wants to vote Democrat," which does a good job of pointing out the way politics is working in the South once the military is no longer there to enforce order. But still, we have two amendments that the Southern states should have to follow because they're amendments in the Constitution. The 14th, which guarantees citizenship, the 15th, which guarantees voting rights. How are the Southern states and then later the Northern states able to get around these amendments to create their society based on racial superiority? Well, the first is segregation. The 14th Amendment, of course, as you know, and the Civil Rights Acts of 1875 is going to guarantee equal treatment, equal protection, equal access to public accommodations, to public transportation, allowing Black people to serve on juries, right? It's really important to go and trial and have a jury of your peers. And sadly, those elements of the Civil Rights Act are going to be overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in the civil rights cases of 1883. As the court's going to argue that Congress doesn't have the authority to regulate private people and private businesses, that those are left to their own regulation. In doing so, this allows Southern states and cities and counties to pass what are called Jim Crow laws. This Jim Crow system is going to be based off of a Black character in what's called minstrel shows, like plays, in which this Black character is a caricature of the negative stereotypes of Black America. But the Jim Crow laws are going to create public services and facilities that are segregated, an area for Black people, an area for white people, and altogether separate buildings at times for separate hotels, separate rail cars on trains, separate parts of the theaters, separate schools, separate libraries, separate parks, separate beaches they could swim at, etc., all under the name of Jim Crow laws. In 1896, one Black individual was going to sue because he's not allowed on the white part of the train, even though he's 7/8 white. And the Supreme Court is going to really make what I would argue is their second worst decision after Dred Scott. My dog just sneezed. Bless you, Oliver. Their second worst decision after Dred Scott in arguing that this idea of segregation is constitutional and allowed under the ideology of separate but equal. If you separate the races, that's fine as long as they have access to equal accommodations. And this is going to lead then to significant school segregation and public facility segregation. And the Supreme Court is going to authorize it as okay because of this doctrine of separate but equal. So that's the way that the Southern states and later Northern states as well are going to get around the 14th Amendment for citizenship. The way around the 15th Amendment for voting is by a very strategic series of disenfranchisement, which means to lose the right to vote, disenfranchisement measures. Right, as you know, the 15th Amendment says you can't lose the right to vote based on your race, your color, or your previous condition of servitude. So what we'll see instead is ways in which Southern states keep Black males from voting without making it specifically about them being a Black male. First example is grandfather clauses, which argues you can't vote, or there are clauses in local, as you register to vote, you can't register to vote here in this county unless your grandfather also voted in this county. In a sense, that grandfather clause is meant to keep carpetbaggers, Northern Republicans, from voting because their grandfathers didn't vote there because they were living in the North, as well as Black people from voting because their grandfathers weren't voting there because they were slaves. So the grandfather clause is not specifically about race, but what it does is it keeps Black people from voting. The second is poll taxes, having to pay a yearly tax to register to vote. Well, if you're a sharecropper who's barely making ends meet, working on somebody else's farm with no access to currency, how are you going to pay a tax? Additionally, if you're a very, very, very poor white or Black person, what are you going to do? Are you going to pay to feed your family, or are you going to pay to vote? Right. So what the poll tax does is it keeps Black people from voting. It keeps some white people from voting too, but that's a price that the white South's willing to pay. No pun intended, taxes, because it keeps Black voters from voting in large numbers. The third is literacy tests. These incredibly complex and challenging assessments that poll workers will require voters to pass before voting, that are borderline impossible to pass. And as you know, because of a lack of access to education, Black Americans in the post-Civil War South are even worse at a disadvantage to pass tests like this. And as you can see, none of these three things have anything to do on their face with race, but yet underneath it, as you dig a little deeper and look under the hood, they are designed to keep Black voters off the polls. And the fourth way is white primaries. As you know, primary elections is when you vote on the potential candidates, decide who the candidate's going to be. States are going to create white primaries so that the only people that are allowed in the primary vote are white, which then in the South means Democrat, and then open up the election for other people to vote in the general election. But then you're picking between two white Democrats. So then really as a Black Southerner, what's the difference? So that's the way Reconstruction fails and the consequences in the next 40 years of Reconstruction. Another incredibly telling consequence is lynching. I have linked on your handout a very short video, a 6-minute video that I'm going to really ask that you watch because it's very telling and it's very well done. And it speaks to the highs and the lows of Reconstruction, as well as some of the legacies that are still unfinished today. And out of this project that you're going to watch a video from is lynchings per county, really from the end of Reconstruction into the 1940s. Right? And we can see that centered here in the Deep South, where so many former slaves are located, a huge amount of white supremacist lynching violence by county, centered on what was the Cotton Belt and the Mississippi River. So it's important to note that even when Reconstruction is no longer in effect, white resistance to any semblance of Black progress is still utilized strongly, consistently, and across the board. And later on, we'll also look at some lynching numbers in northern states as well, because this is not solely a Southern phenomenon. So watch that short video. I think it's a good way to conclude Reconstruction. It's only 6 minutes long and it's well done. And it's from a nonprofit project that I think is worth supporting with some clicks. So give that a watch, answer your last question, and I'll see you in our live session for your final. Thanks, y'all.